The shrapnel tore through Devin Harris's abdomen at 11:47 a.m. on what had started as a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. As her blood pooled in the Norwegian dirt, staining the wildflowers red, she had two choices: collapse and let the enemy convoy escape, or stay conscious long enough to paint laser targets for the F-16s circling overhead. What happened next would redefine everything her unit thought they knew about courage, determination, and what a 22-year-old forward observer could accomplish when everyone had already written her off as too young, too inexperienced, too fragile for real combat operations. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. Forward Operating Base Nordkapp sat like a stubborn metal thumb pressed into the Norwegian tundra, its prefabricated buildings and razor-wire fence cutting an unnatural line against the sweeping landscape of moss-covered rocks and scattered birch trees. The morning sun cast long shadows across the compound, highlighting the contrast between military precision and the wild beauty of the Arctic Circle. Devin Harris stood at the edge of the communications tower, her breath visible in the crisp air as she adjusted the satellite array that connected their remote outpost to NATO command. At 22, she was the youngest forward observer in the Norwegian Armed Forces Joint Terminal Attack Controller Program, a distinction that carried more burden than pride. The JTAC role required someone who could coordinate airstrikes with surgical precision, painting laser targets for fighter jets while operating in the most dangerous forward positions. The base operated on a rhythm as predictable as the midnight sun. Morning briefings at 0700, equipment checks at 0800, patrol assignments distributed by 0900. Devin had learned this routine during her 8 months at Nordkapp, watching from the sidelines as more experienced operators received the critical missions while she was relegated to equipment maintenance and communication relay duties. Captain Erik Lundgren commanded the Forward Observer Unit with the weathered authority of someone who'd spent 15 years calling in airstrikes across 3 different conflicts. His team of 6 JTACs formed the elite core of the base's offensive capabilities, each one hand-picked for their experience, their proven track record under fire, and their ability to remain calm while enemy fire rained down around them. They were the ones who painted targets for the F-16s, F-35s, and Apache helicopters that could turn the tide of any engagement. Devin watched these men prepare for their missions with a mixture of admiration and frustration that had become her constant companion. Sergeant Magnus Eriksson, Lundgren's second-in-command, was built like a Viking warrior and moved with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. Corporal Bjorn Andersen could calculate targeting coordinates in his head faster than most people could use a calculator. Private Lars Johansson had survived 3 IED explosions and still volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. These were the soldiers who mattered when lives were on the line. These were the ones who received the nods of respect in the mess hall, whose opinions carried weight during mission planning, whose expertise was never questioned. Devin, despite scoring higher than any of them on the technical certification exams, was still viewed as the unit's promising apprentice, someone with potential who needed more time to develop, more experience to earn her stripes, more growth to handle the psychological pressure of real combat operations. The Arctic deployment had been sold to her as an opportunity to gain experience in a relatively stable environment. Norway's relationship with its eastern neighbors had been tense but manageable, with most incidents limited to airspace violations and electronic warfare probing. It was considered a good place for a young JTAC to learn the ropes without facing the intense combat pressure of more active theaters. But Devin had seen the intelligence reports. She'd noticed the pattern of increased reconnaissance flights, the subtle repositioning of enemy assets across the border, the way communication intercepts had shifted from routine chatter to operational coordination. While her superiors discussed these developments in measured tones during classified briefings, she'd been developing her own analysis, creating detailed threat assessments that she kept in a personal notebook. Her fellow soldiers saw her constant note-taking and map study as the enthusiasm of someone trying too hard to impress. What they didn't realize was that Devin's mind worked differently than theirs. Where they saw individual incidents and separate tactical challenges, she perceived patterns and connections. Her civilian education in systems analysis, completed before her military service, had trained her to look for relationships that others might miss. The morning briefing began like every other, with Captain Lundgren standing before a wall-mounted map marked with colored pins and operational boundaries. Intelligence suggested increased vehicle movement in Sector 12, approximately 40 kilometers northeast of their position. Satellite imagery showed what appeared to be a supply convoy, but electronic signatures indicated the presence of advanced communication equipment that suggested something more significant than routine logistics. "Erickson, you'll take primary JTAC position for today's reconnaissance mission," Lundgren announced, his finger tracing the planned route on the map. "Anderson, you're backup. Johansson, you'll handle communication relay. We need positive identification on this convoy and real-time assessment of their capabilities." Devin raised her hand, the same gesture she'd made dozens of times before. "Sir, the terrain in Sector 12 has several elevated positions that would provide better targeting angles. I've identified 3 locations that offer optimal laser designation while maintaining covered withdrawal routes." Lundgren glanced at her with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Harris, your enthusiasm is noted, but this is advanced reconnaissance work. You'll remain at base to monitor communications and coordinate with air traffic control. We need someone reliable handling the technical support." The words, "someone reliable handling technical support," echoed in Devin's mind as she walked toward the communications center, her boots crunching against the gravel path that connected the base's various buildings. 8 months of proving herself, 8 months of perfect performance evaluations, and she was still viewed as the person who stayed behind while others did the real work. At 5 feet 4 inches and 115 pounds, Devin Harris looked more like a university student than a military operator. Her slight frame and youthful appearance had been obstacles from the day she'd entered basic training. Drill instructors had initially assumed she'd wash out during the physical requirements. Fellow recruits had offered to carry her pack during long marches, certain she couldn't maintain their pace. Even her family had expressed quiet doubts about her chosen career path, wondering if she might be better suited to military intelligence or logistics rather than frontline combat operations. What none of them understood was that Devin's size had never defined her limitations. It had shaped her advantages. Growing up as the smallest player on every sports team had taught her to outthink opponents rather than overpower them. Her childhood spent rock climbing with her father in the Norwegian fjords had developed an intuitive understanding of terrain and positioning that couldn't be taught in any military school. Her engineering studies had trained her mind to see systems and solutions where others saw only problems. But in a military culture that equated physical presence with leadership potential, these advantages often remained invisible. The same analytical mind that could identify the optimal laser designation position was dismissed as overthinking when it came from someone who looked like she could be blown over by a strong wind. The same systematic approach that had earned her the highest scores in JTAC certification was viewed as book learning rather than practical experience. Devin had learned to navigate these assumptions carefully. She volunteered for additional training without calling attention to herself. She studied operational manuals during off-duty hours, memorizing procedures and protocols until they became second nature. She had developed detailed knowledge of every piece of equipment on the base, not because it was her assigned responsibility, but because understanding the tools made her more effective at using them. Her personal preparation extended far beyond what anyone expected from a junior operator. While her colleagues spent evening hours playing cards or video games in the recreation center, Devin studied topographical maps and satellite imagery. She had created her own database of potential landing zones, extraction points, and tactical positions within a 100-kilometer radius of their base. Her notebook contained detailed weather pattern analysis, enemy movement predictions, and contingency plans for scenarios that military doctrine said were unlikely to occur. The irony was that her comprehensive preparation often worked against her. When she offered insights based on her analysis, superiors viewed it as a junior soldier overstepping her bounds rather than valuable intelligence. When she suggested alternative approaches to tactical problems, it was seen as questioning the judgment of more experienced operators rather than contributing to mission success. The communications center hummed with electronic activity as Devin settled into her assigned station. Banks of monitors displayed real-time data feeds from satellites, drone surveillance, and electronic intelligence gathering systems. This was where she spent most of her operational time, serving as the crucial link between field operators and command authority. She was skilled at this work, perhaps more skilled than anyone else on the base, but it kept her physically removed from the action where lives were won or lost. Through her headset, she could monitor the progress of Ericsson's reconnaissance team as they moved toward Sector 12. Their radio chatter was professional and confident, the sound of experienced operators conducting routine business. But as Devin tracked their movement on her displays, she noticed discrepancies between their reported positions and the optimal routes she had identified in her personal analysis. "Base, this is Wolf 1, Ericsson's voice crackled through the communication system. "We're approaching the first checkpoint. Terrain is rougher than expected, but we're maintaining schedule." Devin pulled up her own terrain analysis and frowned. The route Ericsson was taking would expose his team to observation from elevated positions that enemy forces could easily occupy. Her recommended approach would have avoided this exposure while actually reducing travel time. But suggesting course corrections from her position in the communications center would be seen as micromanaging field operators who hadn't asked for her input. She made notes in her logbook documenting the tactical choices she was observing. If the mission encountered problems, her analysis might prove valuable for after-action review. If it succeeded without incident, her observations would simply be another entry in a notebook that no one would ever read. The morning progressed with routine efficiency, but Devin's attention remained focused on the subtle indicators that others were missing. Electronic surveillance showed increased activity in areas adjacent to the reconnaissance route. Communication intercepts revealed coordination patterns that suggested more than routine supply movement. Weather data indicated atmospheric conditions that could affect air support if emergency extraction became necessary. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The pattern had become so predictable that Devin could almost script the conversations before they happened. Each morning brought new intelligence reports, each afternoon delivered mission assignments, and each evening ended with her watching the real operators return from field work while she compiled their communications logs and equipment reports. 3 weeks earlier, when satellite imagery revealed suspicious construction activity near the Russian border, Captain Lundgren had assembled his senior team for a reconnaissance mission that would require advanced infiltration techniques and precision targeting capabilities. Devin had spent 2 days analyzing the satellite data, identifying optimal observation points, and calculating firing solutions for various air support scenarios. When she presented her analysis during the preliminary briefing, Lundgren had thanked her for her thorough preparation work and then assigned the mission to Ericsson and Anderson. Harris provides excellent intelligence support, she'd overheard him telling Major Kastner during their post-briefing discussion. But this kind of deep reconnaissance requires operators with extensive field experience. We can't risk mission failure by putting untested personnel in critical positions. The same dynamic repeated itself when a high-value target was identified operating from a compound in Sector 9. Devin's analysis had identified the optimal approach routes, calculated the timing windows for air support, and even developed contingency plans for various extraction scenarios. Her work had been incorporated into the final mission plan, but execution was assigned to Corporal Anderson with Johansson as backup. "Your technical skills are valuable," Lundgren had told her during her monthly performance review, "but leadership in combat situations requires a different kind of experience. The men need to have confidence in their JTAC, and that confidence comes from proven performance under fire." It was a circular logic that frustrated Devin more than any direct criticism could have. She couldn't gain combat experience without being assigned to combat missions, but she wouldn't be assigned to combat missions until she had combat experience. Meanwhile, her male colleagues had been given opportunities to prove themselves in relatively low-risk situations that gradually built their reputations and expanded their responsibilities. The exclusion wasn't malicious. Devin recognized that her superiors genuinely believed they were making responsible decisions. But the effect was the same as if it had been deliberate discrimination. She remained trapped in a support role while others advanced to positions where their contributions had direct impact on mission success. The frustration deepened during training exercises, where artificial constraints removed the life-or-death stakes that supposedly justified keeping her on the sidelines. During a joint training operation with Danish Special Forces, Devin had been assigned to coordinate communications while Eriksson and Anderson practiced calling in simulated airstrikes. But when equipment failures disrupted their laser targeting systems, Devin had improvised a solution using backup equipment and alternative frequencies that allowed the exercise to continue. "Nice work, Harris," the Danish team leader had commented afterward. "You've got good instincts for tactical problem solving. Have you considered applying for advanced JTAC training?" The irony was bitter. Foreign operators who had worked with her for 3 days could recognize capabilities that her own unit leadership couldn't see after 8 months of collaboration. Her technical innovations during the exercise had prevented mission failure, but the success was attributed to good communication support rather than tactical leadership. The pattern extended beyond mission assignments to social interactions within the unit. When the men gathered to discuss tactics and share experiences from previous deployments, Devin's presence changed the dynamic. Conversations became more formal, more careful, as if her colleagues were conscious of explaining things that she might not understand. War stories that had been told and retold among the group were edited or abbreviated when she was present. "It's not personal," Sergeant Eriksson had explained when she asked about the shift in group dynamics. "It's just that some of our experiences are pretty intense. We don't want to make you uncomfortable with details that might be difficult to handle." The protective instinct was well-intentioned, but ultimately infantilizing. Devin had completed the same psychological evaluations as her male colleagues. She had received identical training in combat stress management and trauma response. But she was still viewed as someone who needed to be sheltered from the realities that others were expected to confront as part of their professional duties. Even her technical expertise was subtly diminished through the lens of gender assumptions. When she identified equipment problems or suggested maintenance modifications, her recommendations were often attributed to her attention to detail rather than her engineering knowledge. When she developed innovative solutions to communication challenges, the success was explained by her natural organizational skills rather than her systematic approach to problem solving. The cumulative effect was a constant sense of being professionally invisible. Her contributions were acknowledged but not valued, her capabilities recognized but not utilized, her potential noted but not developed. She existed in a liminal space between civilian and soldier, between support staff and operator, between competent professional and trusted colleague. Captain Lundgren's latest decision crystallized everything that frustrated Devin about her position. Intelligence had identified a new pattern of enemy activity that required continuous surveillance and potential interdiction. The mission would last 5 days and require teams to operate from forward positions with minimal support. It was exactly the kind of challenging assignment that would demonstrate advanced JTAC capabilities and provide the combat experience necessary for career advancement. All three senior operators had volunteered for the mission. Lundgren had selected Eriksson as primary JTAC and Anderson as backup, with Johansson handling extended communications support. The decision made perfect sense from a risk management perspective, but it also ensured that Devin would spend another week monitoring radio communications while others gained the experience that would justify future mission assignments. The conversations Devin wasn't supposed to hear were often the most revealing about how her colleagues truly perceived her capabilities. Late evening discussions in the recreation area, hushed exchanges during equipment maintenance, casual comments between missions, all painted a picture of institutional assumptions that had calcified into unquestioned truth. "Look, Harris is competent," she'd overheard Corporal Anderson telling Private Johansson during a routine equipment check. "But there's a difference between knowing the procedures and executing them when someone's shooting at you. Combat operations aren't just about technical skills." The comment had followed Devin's perfect performance during a laser targeting simulation, where she had achieved accuracy scores that exceeded everyone else in the unit. But rather than demonstrating her competence under pressure, her success was dismissed as irrelevant to real-world applications. "She's smart, I'll give her that," Johansson had replied. "But smart doesn't always translate to effective when the situation gets chaotic. You need someone who can maintain focus when everything's falling apart." These were the same men who had seen Devin troubleshoot complex technical problems under time pressure, who had watched her remain calm during emergency communications crises, who had benefited from her ability to coordinate multiple data streams simultaneously. But somehow her demonstrated capacity to perform under stress was considered irrelevant to combat situations that required exactly those same capabilities. The assumptions extended beyond individual opinions to become embedded in institutional decision-making. During the monthly unit assessment meeting, Devin had listened from the communications center as senior leadership discussed personnel assignments for upcoming operations. "Harris continues to excel in support roles," Major Kastner had observed, reviewing her performance evaluations. "Her technical skills are exceptional, and her analytical work has contributed significantly to mission success rates." "Absolutely," Captain Lundgren had agreed. "She's exactly the kind of soldier you want handling critical support functions. Reliable, thorough, never creates problems." "But," Kastner had prompted, sensing unspoken reservations. "No buts, really. It's just that forward observer work requires a particular kind of temperament. Combat leadership demands someone who can make life or death decisions instantly, who can maintain authority under extreme stress, who can inspire confidence in other soldiers during the worst possible circumstances." The conversation continued with Lundgren explaining his philosophy about combat leadership, emphasizing the importance of physical presence, command voice, and the intangible qualities that made soldiers willing to follow orders without question. None of these attributes were directly related to JTAC technical skills, but they had become the unofficial criteria for advancement within the unit. "I'm not questioning her courage or her competence," Lundgren had concluded. "But there's a reason why forward observer positions have traditionally been filled with certain characteristics. The role demands someone who can project authority and maintain team cohesion under combat stress." These certain characteristics were never explicitly defined, but the pattern was clear enough. Every JTAC in the unit's history had been male, physically imposing, and possessed of the kind of aggressive confidence that military culture associated with combat effectiveness. Devin's analytical approach, systematic preparation, and collaborative leadership style were viewed as valuable support qualities, but unsuitable for frontline operations. The dismissive environment was reinforced through countless small interactions that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively created a culture of diminished expectations. When Devin offered tactical suggestions during mission planning, they were politely noted but rarely incorporated into final plans. When she identified potential problems with proposed operations, her concerns were dismissed as overanalysis or excessive caution. When she volunteered for challenging assignments, she was thanked for her enthusiasm, but redirected toward responsibilities that better matched her skill set. Equipment assignments reflected the same assumptions. Devin was issued standard support gear, but never received the specialized targeting equipment, advanced communication systems, or weapon modifications that frontline operators considered essential. When she requested access to equipment that would allow her to train on advanced procedures, she was told that such resources were limited and needed to be prioritized for soldiers who would actually use them in combat situations. The training schedule revealed similar biases. Advanced tactical courses, specialized certifications, and cross-training opportunities were routinely offered to her male colleagues, but not extended to Devin. When she inquired about participating in such programs, she was encouraged to focus on developing her existing strengths rather than expanding into areas where she might be less effective. "We want to maximize everyone's potential," Lieutenant Colonel Bergen had explained during her career development counseling session. "But that means identifying where each soldier can make their greatest contribution. Your analytical skills and technical expertise are exactly what we need in intelligence support roles." The career guidance was presented as recognizing her unique talents, but the effect was to channel her development away from operational assignments toward increasingly specialized support functions. She was being encouraged to become indispensable in roles that would never lead to the kind of combat experience necessary for advancement to senior leadership positions. Even her physical training was subtly discouraged from military-relevant activities. When Devin requested permission to attend sniper school, she was told that marksmanship training was less important for her assignments than computer systems education. When she asked about participating in advanced survival courses, she was encouraged to focus on communications technology updates instead. The message was consistent. Devin's value lay in her ability to support others, rather than developing her own operational capabilities. While her colleagues spent their off-duty hours relaxing in the recreation center or sleeping off the exhaustion of training exercises, Devin Harris was methodically transforming herself into the operator that no one believed she could become. Her preparation was comprehensive, obsessive, and entirely invisible to the leadership that had decided she was better suited for support roles. The technical manuals were just the beginning. Every evening after completing her assigned duties, Devin studied advanced targeting procedures, memorizing the specifications for every aircraft in NATO's inventory. She learned the capabilities and limitations of F-16 Fighting Falcons, F-35 Lightning IIs, Apache helicopters, and A-10 Warthogs, until she could calculate their approach angles, weapon delivery parameters, and fuel consumption rates without consulting reference materials. But technical knowledge was only part of what distinguished an exceptional JTAC from a competent one. The real skill lay in understanding terrain, weather, enemy capabilities, and the dozens of variables that could affect the success or failure of close air support missions. This was where Devin's engineering background became her secret weapon. Using her personal laptop and satellite internet access, she had compiled a comprehensive database of every square kilometer within 200 miles of their base. Elevation maps, soil composition analysis, weather pattern histories, vegetation density studies, information that would allow her to predict how different locations would affect radio communications, laser targeting effectiveness, and aircraft approach routes under various conditions. Her physical preparation was equally systematic. The base gym was officially available 24 hours a day, but few soldiers used it during the early morning hours when Devin conducted her training sessions. While her colleagues assumed she was simply maintaining basic fitness standards, she was actually developing capabilities that exceeded most of their own performance levels. Rock climbing had been her passion long before military service, and the Norwegian landscape provided perfect training opportunities. During weekend leave periods, she explored the fjords and mountain faces within driving distance of the base, developing an intuitive understanding of how to move efficiently through vertical terrain. The skills she developed weren't directly applicable to desert or urban combat operations, but they built the kind of spatial awareness and risk assessment capabilities that translated to any challenging environment. Her marksmanship training occurred during off-duty hours at the base firing range. While her official assignments rarely required anything beyond basic weapons proficiency, Devin had developed precision shooting skills that rivaled those of designated marksmen. She practiced with every weapon system available on the base, learning not just how to fire them accurately, but how to maintain them under adverse conditions and adapt them for specialized applications. The communications equipment provided her greatest opportunity for covert skill development. As the soldier responsible for maintaining the base's electronic systems, she had legitimate access to advanced gear that others rarely used. During routine maintenance operations, she experimented with frequency modulation, signal encryption, and range extension techniques that weren't covered in standard training programs. Her innovation with communications technology had practical applications that her supervisors never fully understood. When she improved signal clarity during routine operations, they attributed it to better equipment maintenance. When she found ways to extend communication range during challenging weather conditions, they assumed it was simply good technical support. They didn't realize that she was developing advanced electronic warfare capabilities that could prove decisive during complex operations. The tactical knowledge came from sources that her colleagues never bothered to access. Devin studied after-action reports from combat operations in Afghanistan, Syria, and Eastern Europe, analyzing how different units had adapted JTAC procedures to specific threats and terrain challenges. She read academic papers on military tactics, psychological studies on performance under stress, and technical analyses of emerging threats that could affect NATO operations. Her analytical approach extended to understanding her own unit's capabilities and limitations. She had quietly mapped the communication patterns, decision-making processes, and personality characteristics of every soldier on the base, not from any desire to manipulate or undermine them, but from a systems analyst's instinct to understand how organizations functioned under stress. This knowledge became particularly valuable when she began developing contingency plans for scenarios that official doctrine considered unlikely. What would happen if the base came under direct attack? How would they coordinate defense if normal communication systems were compromised? What equipment and personnel would be needed to maintain operations if they were cut off from higher command for extended periods? Her contingency planning wasn't paranoid preparation. It was the kind of risk assessment that engineering training had taught her to conduct automatically. But the scenarios she prepared for were exactly the kind of high-stress, rapidly evolving situations where her unique combination of technical skills and systematic thinking could prove most valuable. The most important element of her preparation was psychological. Devin had studied every available resource on combat stress management, tactical decision-making under pressure, and leadership during crisis situations. She had developed mental exercises and visualization techniques that would allow her to maintain focus during chaotic situations. More importantly, she had studied the psychology of her own unit members. She understood Eriksson's tendency toward over-aggressive tactics, Anderson's difficulty with rapid plan modifications, and Johansson's pattern of communication breakdown under extreme stress. This knowledge wasn't gathered for malicious purposes. It was the kind of team assessment that any good leader conducted to maximize group effectiveness. The first indication that Tuesday would be different came through electronic surveillance rather than visual observation. At 03:47 hours, automated monitoring systems detected a surge in encrypted radio traffic from sectors previously classified as low-priority surveillance zones. The pattern was subtle, brief transmission bursts scattered across multiple frequencies, but distinctive enough to trigger algorithmic analysis protocols that Devin had helped design. She was alone in the communications center, pulling an early morning shift that had become routine since arriving at Forward Operating Base Nordkapp. The base operated with reduced personnel during pre-dawn hours, leaving critical systems monitoring to a skeleton crew of specialists who could handle routine intelligence processing and emergency communications. The data streams painting themselves across her multiple monitors told a story that became increasingly concerning with each passing hour. Vehicle movement patterns showed coordinated activity across a 50-kilometer front, not the random commercial traffic or routine military exercises that characterized normal border area activity. Communication intercepts revealed operational coordination between units that intelligence databases indicated rarely worked together. By 6:30 a.m., Devin had compiled enough evidence to justify waking Captain Lundgren for an emergency briefing. The intelligence picture suggested a major operation in development, something significantly larger than the routine probing actions that NATO forces had grown accustomed to managing through diplomatic channels rather than military response. "How certain are you about this assessment?" Lundgren asked, studying the compilation of data that Devin had organized into a comprehensive threat analysis. His expression was serious but skeptical, the kind of look that suggested he was weighing the credibility of intelligence against the career consequences of overreacting to incomplete information. "Sir, the pattern is consistent with pre-attack coordination," Devin replied, pointing to specific data points on her analysis. "Vehicle movements suggest battalion-level forces moving into forward positions. Communication intercepts indicate operational planning for time-sensitive actions. Electronic warfare signatures show advanced countermeasures being deployed." Lundgren studied the documents for several minutes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about methodology and confidence levels. Devin could see him calculating the risks of various response options, the diplomatic complications of raising alert levels based on pattern analysis, the operational challenges of preparing defensive measures against uncertain threats, and the personal consequences of either overreacting or underreacting to intelligence that might prove inaccurate. "Continue monitoring," he decided finally. "Compile hourly updates and notify me immediately if the threat indicators intensify. I'll brief Major Kastner at 800 hours and recommend increased readiness postures for forward units." The decision was reasonable, professionally appropriate, and potentially catastrophic. Devin recognized the institutional momentum that would delay meaningful response for hours while leaders consulted higher command, analyzed political implications, and developed response options through normal bureaucratic channels. By the time official action was authorized, whatever operation was developing would likely have advanced beyond the preparation phase. Throughout the morning, the intelligence picture continued to deteriorate. Electronic surveillance detected jamming systems being activated in sectors that had previously shown no significant military activity. Satellite imagery revealed camouflage positions that hadn't existed during the previous day's reconnaissance passes. Most concerningly, communication intercepts suggested zero-hour timing that indicated operations would commence within hours rather than days. At 1100 hours, the first visual confirmation arrived through drone surveillance. A mechanized column approximately company-sized was moving through terrain that intelligence assessments had classified as impassable for heavy vehicles. The force included main battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, and mobile missile systems, equipment that suggested something far more serious than routine border exercises or diplomatic pressure tactics. "This is not a training exercise," Major Kastner announced during the emergency briefing that followed the drone intelligence. "We're looking at a probe operation designed to test NATO response capabilities. Higher command is coordinating diplomatic efforts, but we need to be prepared for military action if dialogue fails." The response plan followed standard NATO protocols for graduated escalation. Diplomatic protests would be filed through appropriate channels, electronic countermeasures would be activated to disrupt enemy communications, air assets would be positioned for rapid response if military action became necessary. Ground forces would maintain defensive positions while avoiding provocative actions that might escalate the situation. It was a measured, professional response that reflected decades of alliance experience managing border tensions without triggering larger conflicts. It was also a response that assumed several hours of preparation time, predictable enemy behavior, and the luxury of choosing when and where to engage hostile forces. But the electronic intelligence that Devin continued monitoring suggested that enemy forces weren't following the gradual escalation model that NATO doctrine expected. Communication intercepts indicated accelerated timelines. Vehicle movements suggested immediate action rather than extended preparation. Most critically, jamming operations were intensifying in patterns that suggested incoming attacks rather than defensive positioning. At 11:43 hours, Devin detected the electronic signature of target acquisition radars being activated in positions that would allow direct fire on NATO installations. The enemy force wasn't probing for diplomatic advantage or testing alliance resolve. They were preparing to attack. The base alarm system shattered the morning calm with its piercing electronic wail, sending soldiers scrabbling from buildings across the compound as the announcement echoed through speakers mounted on every structure. All personnel to battle stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, all personnel to battle stations. Devin rushed from the communications center toward the command post, her mind already processing the tactical implications of the intelligence she'd compiled. The enemy force was positioned to strike multiple targets simultaneously, but their electronic signatures revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited if NATO air assets could coordinate attacks before the enemy completed their preparations. Captain Lundgren stood at the center of organized chaos in the command center, coordinating with higher command while receiving real-time intelligence updates from multiple sources. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red enemy positions and blue friendly forces in a pattern that showed how quickly the tactical situation was deteriorating. "Status report," Major Kastner demanded as he entered the command center, his uniform hastily assembled, but his demeanor focused entirely on the crisis at hand. "Enemy mechanized force has crossed the border at 3 points, Lundgren reported, pointing to positions on the main tactical display. Battalion strength supported by mobile artillery and air defense systems. They're advancing towards strategic communications nodes and supply depots." Devin studied the enemy positions and felt her analytical mind automatically begin calculating optimal targeting solutions. The enemy had made tactical errors in their positioning. Their air defense systems were concentrated to protect their main advance, but had left flanks vulnerable to coordinated airstrikes. If JTAC teams could reach elevated positions within 12 kilometers of the enemy concentration, they could paint laser targets for F-16s that were already being scrambled from bases in southern Norway. "Sir," she interrupted, stepping forward with the confidence that came from absolute certainty in her analysis. "I've identified optimal targeting positions for close air support. The enemy has left their eastern flank exposed to enfilade fire from Ridge Complex Alpha 7. Lundgren turned toward her with the expression of someone dealing with too many priorities simultaneously. "Harris, we need you coordinating communication support from the command center. This isn't the time for theoretical analysis." "Sir, this isn't theoretical," Devin pressed, pulling out the detailed topographical maps she'd been studying for months. "I've analyzed every possible approach route and targeting position within 50 kilometers. Ridge Complex Alpha 7 provides direct line of sight to enemy formations while offering covered withdrawal routes if extraction becomes necessary." Major Kastner examined the maps that Devin spread across the table, his finger tracing the routes she'd identified. "How long to reach these positions?" 47 minutes by vehicle to the base of the Ridge Complex, then 18 minutes climbing to optimal targeting elevation. Weather conditions are perfect for laser designation, and atmospheric clarity will provide maximum range for target elimination. "Absolutely not," Lundgren said firmly. "Harris, you're not qualified for forward JTAC operations under combat conditions. This is exactly the kind of high-risk situation that requires experienced operators." "Sir, Erickson and Anderson are both committed to defensive positions," Devin pointed out, indicating their locations on the tactical display. "Johansson is coordinating electronic warfare countermeasures. I'm the only JTAC currently available for forward deployment." The silence that followed was filled with radio chatter, electronic warning signals, and the distant sound of helicopters preparing for combat operations. Everyone in the command center understood that the tactical situation required immediate action, but institutional instincts conflicted with operational necessities. "The ridge approach is technically challenging," Captain Lundgren observed, studying Devin's route analysis. "The climbing sections would be difficult for experienced mountaineers, let alone soldiers carrying full combat equipment." "I've climbed every section of that route during off-duty hours. I know exactly where the handholds are, which sections require rope assistance, and where the rock is unstable. I can reach the targeting position faster than anyone else in this unit." "That's not the issue. The issue is whether you can maintain effectiveness under combat stress while coordinating multiple airstrikes against hardened targets. This is not equipment maintenance or communication support. This is life-or-death tactical decision-making." The radio crackled with increasingly urgent reports as enemy forces advanced toward their primary objectives. "Base Command, this is Wolf 2. Enemy armor is 12 kilometers from Checkpoint Bravo and closing fast. We need close air support immediately or we're going to lose the communications hub." Major Kastner's jaw tightened as he studied the tactical display showing red enemy icons moving steadily toward blue-friendly positions. The mathematics were brutal and simple. NATO forces were outnumbered 3-1 at the point of contact, and defensive positions that had seemed adequate for border security were proving insufficient against a coordinated mechanized assault. "Sir, F-16s are airborne and requesting target coordinates," the air liaison officer reported, "but they need laser designation for precision strikes on armored targets." Devin watched the tactical situation deteriorate while her proposed solution was debated through institutional channels that moved too slowly for combat operations. Every minute spent on personnel discussions was another minute that allowed enemy forces to consolidate positions and advance toward objectives that would fundamentally alter the strategic balance in the region. "Harris, stand down," Captain Lundgren ordered, noticing her preparation to leave the command center. "You're needed here to coordinate communication support for deployed units." But Devin was no longer listening to institutional authority. She was calculating time-distance factors, weapons effects, and probability matrices that showed Norwegian soldiers dying while commanders debated the appropriateness of deploying their most qualified available JTAC because she didn't match their assumptions about combat leadership. The turning point came when Corporal Anderson's voice crackled through the radio with barely controlled panic. "Base Command, we're taking heavy fire from enemy positions in Sector 7. Our targeting equipment is damaged and we cannot provide laser designation for air support. Repeat, we cannot provide laser designation." The tactical display showed Anderson's position being overrun within minutes if air support couldn't engage enemy armor that was advancing without effective opposition. 3 vehicles full of Norwegian soldiers were about to be destroyed, while F-16s circled overhead with precision munitions they couldn't deliver without forward observer support. "Sir," Devin said quietly, her voice cutting through the radio chatter and tactical discussions. "Those soldiers are going to die in the next 10 minutes. I can prevent that from happening, but only if I leave now." Major Kastner turned toward her with an expression that mixed desperation with institutional paralysis. "Harris, if I authorize this deployment and you're killed, I'll spend the rest of my career explaining why I sent an unqualified soldier on a suicide mission. And if you don't authorize it and those soldiers die, you'll spend the rest of your career explaining why you let them die while keeping a qualified soldier on communications duty." The brutal honesty of her response silenced the command center. Everyone present understood that institutional procedures were colliding with tactical necessities in a way that would result in casualties regardless of which decision was made. But only one choice offered the possibility of mission success. "I cannot officially authorize this deployment," Kastner said finally, his words carefully chosen to provide institutional cover while acknowledging tactical reality. "But I also cannot prevent soldiers from making personal decisions about their responsibilities to their fellow service members." It was the closest thing to authorization that military bureaucracy could provide under impossible circumstances. Devin understood immediately that she was being given unofficial permission to take unauthorized action, a bureaucratic contradiction that would protect her commanders while allowing her to attempt the mission that everyone knew was necessary but no one could officially approve. "Harris," Captain Lundgren called as she moved toward the exit, "if you do this, you're completely on your own. We cannot provide backup support, extraction assistance, or command coordination. You'll be operating beyond our ability to help you." Devin paused at the doorway and looked back at the tactical display, showing enemy forces advancing toward positions that would cost dozens of lives if they weren't stopped immediately. "Sir, I've been on my own for 8 months. The only difference is that now it matters." She left the command center knowing that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Whether she succeeded or failed, her actions would be scrutinized by boards of inquiry that would determine whether she was a hero who saved lives or a reckless soldier who violated orders and endangered missions. But the risk of institutional consequences seemed insignificant compared to the certainty of tactical failure if nothing was done. The equipment she needed was already prepared in her personal gear: climbing equipment, advanced targeting systems, and specialized communications gear that she'd been accumulating during months of preparation that no one had considered relevant to her assigned duties. Now that preparation would determine whether Norwegian soldiers lived or died during the next 2 hours. As she loaded her vehicle with equipment and checked her weapons systems, she felt the calm focus that came from finally being able to use capabilities she had developed but never been allowed to demonstrate. The institutional approval she'd sought for 8 months was no longer relevant. What mattered now was executing the mission that everyone knew was necessary, but no one had been willing to assign to her. Devin's vehicle kicked up dust clouds as she drove along the maintenance road that connected forward Operating Base Nordkapp to the network of communication relay stations scattered across the Norwegian wilderness. Her unauthorized departure had been noticed immediately, but radio attempts to recall her had been met with professional silence as she focused entirely on reaching Ridge Complex Alpha 7 before enemy forces advanced beyond effective targeting range. The landscape rushing past her windows was deceptively peaceful. Rolling tundra dotted with wildflowers, birch trees bent by constant Arctic winds, and granite outcroppings that had been carved by glaciers into the complex ridgeline that would become her firing position. It was terrain she'd studied obsessively during off-duty hours, memorizing every elevation change and potential obstacle that could affect her approach to the targeting position. "Harris, respond immediately," Captain Lundgren's voice crackled through her radio. "You are ordered to return to base. This is a direct command." She switched off the radio and concentrated on navigation through terrain that became increasingly challenging as she approached the base of Ridge Complex Alpha 7. The maintenance road deteriorated into a rough track that tested her vehicle's suspension and required careful route selection to avoid obstacles that could disable her transportation. At 12:47 hours, she reached the point where vehicular travel became impossible and began the climbing phase of her approach. The ridge face that rose before her was a nearly vertical wall of granite and schist that would challenge experienced mountaineers under ideal conditions. But Devin had climbed every section of this route during her secret preparation, knew exactly where to find handholds that weren't visible from ground level, and understood which sections required rope assistance and which could be free-climbed with acceptable risk. Her pack contained 67 pounds of specialized equipment, laser targeting systems, advanced communications gear, emergency medical supplies, and enough ammunition to maintain defensive fire if she encountered enemy forces during withdrawal. The weight would have been prohibitive for most soldiers attempting technical climbing, but months of preparation had developed the strength and endurance necessary to carry combat loads through vertical terrain. The first section of the climb took her through a maze of fractured granite that provided excellent handholds but required careful route selection to avoid loose rock that could trigger avalanches. Her movements were efficient and methodical, each placement tested before committing her full weight, each step calculated to minimize energy expenditure while maintaining upward progress. As she climbed higher, radio chatter from tactical frequencies provided constant updates on the deteriorating situation below. Enemy forces had overrun 2 defensive positions and were advancing toward a communication hub that provided coordination for all NATO forces in the region. F-16s were circling overhead with full weapon loads, but couldn't engage without laser designation that would ensure precision strikes against armored targets positioned near civilian infrastructure. The technical crux of the climb came at the 400-meter elevation mark, where the granite face transitioned to an overhanging section that required her to traverse horizontally for nearly 30 meters while supporting her full body weight plus equipment load. It was the kind of climbing that required absolute focus and perfect technique. Any mistake would result in a fall that would end both her mission and her life. Devin moved across the overhang with the fluid efficiency that came from countless hours of practice on similar terrain. Her breathing remained controlled, her movements economical, her focus entirely concentrated on the immediate task of reaching the targeting position while enemy forces continued their advance toward objectives that would cost lives if they weren't stopped within minutes. At 12:31 hours, she crested the final section of the ridge and found herself on a narrow ledge that provided direct line of sight to enemy formations 12 kilometers to the northeast. The tactical picture that spread before her was exactly what her analysis had predicted. Enemy armor concentrated in a valley that offered excellent protection from ground-based anti-tank systems, but left them completely exposed to air attack from her elevated position. She unpacked her laser targeting equipment and began the setup procedures that would allow her to paint targets for the F-16s that were burning fuel while waiting for forward observer support. The advanced systems she had acquired through months of careful equipment procurement were more sophisticated than anything officially issued to forward observers, but they provided targeting precision that could mean the difference between mission success and civilian casualties. Viper Flight, this is Longbow 7, she transmitted on tactical frequencies, using the call sign she'd assigned herself for this unauthorized mission. I have eyes on target area and am preparing to designate multiple armor targets for immediate engagement. The first laser-guided bomb struck target Alpha 1 with devastating precision at 1334 hours, transforming the lead enemy tank into a column of fire and smoke that rose above the valley like a monument to the effectiveness of properly coordinated air support. Devin maintained steady laser illumination despite the concussion wave that shook her position on the granite ledge, her targeting beam never wavering from the designated impact point. Viper Flight, Longbow 7, confirmed direct hit on target Alpha 1, shifting fire to target Alpha 2, enemy APC bearing 051 degrees, range 11.3 kilometers. Her voice remained calm and professional despite the adrenaline surge that came from watching her first combat kill, her analytical mind already calculating the next targeting solution while her hands made precise adjustments to the laser designation system. What the F-16 pilots couldn't see from their altitude was the complexity of the targeting environment that Devin was managing from her elevated position. The enemy formation was positioned in a valley surrounded by civilian infrastructure, farms, residential buildings, and a small hydroelectric plant that provided power to 3 Norwegian communities. The margin for error was measured in meters, and any deviation from precise targeting coordinates would result in civilian casualties that could escalate the conflict beyond NATO's ability to control. But Devin's months of preparation had included detailed study of the area's civilian infrastructure, population density, and potential collateral damage from various weapons effects. She knew exactly where precision strikes could be placed to neutralize military targets while avoiding humanitarian disasters that would undermine political support for defensive operations. Target Alpha 2 eliminated, shifting to Target Alpha 3, mobile artillery system bearing 044 degrees. Each target elimination was accompanied by secondary explosions as ammunition stores detonated, creating a cascade of destruction that was disrupting the enemy's entire operational plan. But more importantly, each successful strike was proof that her unauthorized deployment was achieving tactical objectives that couldn't have been accomplished through conventional force employment. The enemy commander had apparently realized that his formation was being systematically destroyed by precision airstrikes and began implementing countermeasures designed to disrupt forward observer operations.
Smoke generators created artificial concealment that would have defeated standard targeting systems, but Devin's advanced equipment included thermal imaging capabilities that allowed her to maintain target acquisition through most concealment attempts. Viper Flight, Longbow 7. Enemy is deploying countermeasures. I'm switching to thermal targeting mode and can continue designation through smoke screens. The technical sophistication of her equipment was becoming apparent to the pilots who had initially questioned her authorization but were now completely dependent on her targeting support for mission success. As the airstrikes continued, Devin's radio crackled with transmissions from friendly ground units that were beginning to understand the impact of her unauthorized mission. Longbow 7, this is Wolf 2. Whatever you're doing up there, you just saved our lives. Enemy armor was advancing on our position, and we had no way to stop them. The tactical situation was being transformed by her ability to provide precision targeting for air assets that had been circling uselessly while enemy forces advanced toward their objectives. But the real test of her competence came when the enemy began actively trying to locate and eliminate her position with counter-battery fire from mobile artillery systems. The first enemy shells impacted 200 meters below her position, sending granite fragments whistling through the air as the enemy attempted to triangulate her location based on the laser emission signatures they were detecting. Standard doctrine called for forward observers to displace immediately when they came under counter-battery fire, but Devin recognized that moving would give the enemy time to disperse the remaining forces and escape the targeting zone. Instead, she used her detailed knowledge of the local terrain to identify covered positions that would allow her to continue operations while reducing her vulnerability to enemy fire. It was the kind of tactical improvisation that required intimate familiarity with the environment combined with the ability to make rapid risk assessments under combat stress, exactly the capabilities that her superiors had assumed she didn't possess.
The metallic taste of blood filled Devin's mouth as she assessed her injury with the clinical detachment that her medical training had taught her to maintain during crisis situations. The shrapnel had torn through her abdomen, just below her body armor, creating a wound that was bleeding profusely but hadn't struck any vital organs based on her ability to maintain consciousness and motor function. But her medical assessment revealed the brutal mathematics of combat trauma. She was losing blood at a rate that would render her unconscious within 20 to 30 minutes if the bleeding couldn't be controlled. The enemy artillery barrage had achieved its tactical objective, even without a direct hit on her position. Viper Flight, Longbow 7. She transmitted, her voice steady, despite the shockwaves coursing through her system. I'm hit, but still operational. Enemy vehicles are withdrawing toward Checkpoint Charlie. I need immediate strikes on target Alpha 8, command vehicle bearing 039 degrees. The F-16 pilot's response carried concern that penetrated through professional military communications protocol. Longbow 7, copy that you're wounded. Do you require immediate extraction? We can vector search and rescue to your position. Devin looked down at the tactical display on her targeting system, which showed enemy vehicles attempting to escape through a narrow valley that provided their only viable withdrawal route. If they reached Checkpoint Charlie, they would be able to disperse across multiple routes that would make pursuit impossible and allow them to regroup for future attacks on NATO positions. Negative Viper Flight. Extraction would take 45 minutes. An enemy will escape targeting zone. I'm continuing mission. She applied pressure to her wound with her left hand while maintaining targeting operations with her right, using techniques she'd learned during combat medical training that had been designed for exactly this type of situation. The blood loss was affecting her vision and coordination, but not enough to prevent her from maintaining laser designation on moving targets. Her months of preparation had included visualization exercises for operating under various forms of combat stress, including injury scenarios that required her to maintain focus despite physical trauma. Target Alpha 8 eliminated. Shifting to Target Alpha 9, Mobile SAM System, bearing 042 degrees. Each successful target engagement was requiring more effort, as blood loss reduced her cognitive capacity and fine motor control. But her systematic approach to target prioritization allowed her to continue operations even as her physical capabilities deteriorated. The enemy commander had apparently realized that his withdrawal was being systematically interdicted by precision airstrikes and was attempting to accelerate his escape by abandoning damaged vehicles and concentrating his remaining forces in the fastest available platforms. It was a tactically sound decision that would allow some enemy assets to escape, but it also concentrated the remaining targets in a way that maximized the effectiveness of her airstrikes. Longbow 7, this is base command. Captain Lundgren's voice crackled through a radio with an urgency that she'd never heard from him before. Medical evacuation is en route to your position. You need to mark your location for helicopter extraction. Devin looked down at her blood-soaked uniform and calculated the time required for medical evacuation against the tactical window for interdicting the enemy withdrawal. The helicopters would need 20 minutes to reach her position, another 5 minutes to extract her from the ridge, and 15 minutes to reach medical facilities at the base. By the time she was receiving treatment, the enemy force would have dispersed beyond the reach of airstrikes. Base command, Longbow 7. I can complete target interdiction in 12 minutes. Medical evacuation can wait until mission completion. Her voice was beginning to slur slightly as blood loss affected her speech centers, but her determination remained absolute. Harris, that's an order. Mark your position for immediate extraction. Major Kastner's voice joined the radio conversation with command authority that expected immediate compliance. But Devin was no longer operating under normal command structure. She had crossed the line into unauthorized action, and completing her mission successfully was more important than following orders that would result in tactical failure. Base command, the enemy will escape if I stop targeting now. I'm finishing the mission. The tactical display showed 3 remaining high-value targets, 2 mobile artillery systems, and an electronic warfare vehicle that had been coordinating enemy communications throughout the engagement. Eliminating these assets would prevent the enemy from conducting similar operations for months while they replaced specialized equipment and trained replacement crews.
6 weeks later, Devin Harris stood at attention in the same briefing room where she had once been dismissed as too inexperienced for real combat operations. But everything had changed. The NATO Defense Achievement Medal on her uniform reflected light from windows that now illuminated a soldier whose capabilities were no longer questioned by anyone in the Norwegian armed forces. The recovery had been touch and go for the first 72 hours after her evacuation from Ridge Complex Alpha 7. Emergency surgery had revealed internal bleeding more extensive than field assessment had indicated, requiring multiple procedures to repair damage caused by shrapnel that had narrowly missed vital organs. The 4 liters of blood loss had pushed her physiological systems to the edge of irreversible shock. But Devin's physical conditioning and mental preparation had provided the margin that allowed medical intervention to succeed. Her systematic approach to fitness had developed cardiovascular resilience that sustained her through blood loss that would have incapacitated most soldiers. Her psychological training had maintained cognitive function under extreme stress that allowed her to complete her mission despite life-threatening injuries. The after-action review has concluded that Specialist Harris's unauthorized action prevented what would have been the most significant NATO tactical defeat in the region since the alliance's formation, Major General Hauken announced to the assembled personnel. Her precision targeting eliminated an entire enemy mechanized battalion and prevented the capture of strategic installations that would have required weeks to recapture. The briefing room that had once buzzed with dismissive comments about her qualifications was now filled with soldiers who understood that her analytical approach and comprehensive preparation had achieved results that traditional tactics couldn't have accomplished. The men who had questioned her physical capabilities now recognized that her intellectual and technical skills were more valuable than raw strength in modern combat operations. Captain Lundgren, who had once relegated her to communication support duties, now served as her executive officer in the newly formed Special Targeting Unit that had been created specifically to utilize her unique combination of skills. The institutional resistance that had kept her marginalized for 8 months had been replaced by recognition that her systematic approach to tactical problems provided capabilities that the Norwegian armed forces couldn't afford to waste. Harris's mission analysis and target engagement procedures have been incorporated into NATO doctrine as the new standard for precision air support coordination, Colonel Bergen reported. Her equipment modifications and communications protocols are being implemented across all forward observer units in the alliance.
The transformation extended beyond her individual recognition to changes in how the Norwegian military evaluated and utilized personnel capabilities. Her success had prompted comprehensive review of assignment procedures, training programs, and leadership selection criteria that had historically favored traditional military characteristics over innovative thinking and technical expertise. The Special Targeting Unit will be deployed to active theaters where precision engagement capabilities are critical to mission success, Major General Hauken continued. Specialist Harris will serve as unit commander with authority to develop training programs and operational procedures based on her combat experience. Unit commander. The word still carried an impact that Devin found difficult to process completely. 8 months earlier, she had been considered unsuitable for routine reconnaissance missions. Now she was being given authority to train other soldiers and develop tactical doctrine that would be used throughout NATO forces. But the real validation came from the soldiers who had served alongside her before her unauthorized mission. Sergeant Erickson, who had once questioned her suitability for combat operations, now volunteered to serve in her unit despite the career risk of following a commander who had achieved her position through insubordination rather than traditional advancement. "If Harris says something can be done, I believe her," Erickson explained during his transfer interview. "She proved that preparation and intelligence can overcome obstacles that we thought were insurmountable. I want to learn how to think like that." The Norwegian government had initially struggled with how to respond to Devin's violation of orders and unauthorized combat deployment. Military discipline required consequences for insubordination, but tactical success had prevented what intelligence analysis suggested would have been dozens of NATO casualties and the loss of strategic positions. The solution had been promotion rather than punishment. Devin's actions were officially classified as exceptional initiative under combat conditions rather than insubordination, providing institutional cover while acknowledging that her results justified her methods. The enemy forces that Specialist Harris neutralized were significantly more capable than intelligence assessments had indicated. Her quick recognition of the threat and immediate tactical response prevented what could have escalated into a regional conflict requiring major NATO intervention. As the ceremony concluded, Devin reflected on the journey from overlooked logistics specialist to special operations commander. The recognition felt surreal after months of being systematically excluded from meaningful assignments, but it also felt inevitable, given the preparation she had undertaken in anticipation of exactly this type of opportunity. Her unauthorized mission had cost her 4 liters of blood and nearly her life, but it had also proven that institutional assumptions about capability and leadership were often wrong, and that the most important qualification for military success was the determination to act when action was required, regardless of what others considered possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.